Welcome back to TFT Central. Today we're going to be reviewing the new MSI MAG 341 CQP monitor, the company's latest 34-inch ultra-wide OLED, offering a 3440 by 1440 resolution, a 175Hz refresh rate panel, and a load of updated features and extras compared with their previous OLED monitor of this size. We've been hard at work extending our testing so that we can provide you with even more detailed video reviews and more data like we do in our written reviews, so hopefully you'll all welcome those additions here in this review. Before we get into the actual testing and results, let's provide a quick overview of the monitor specs and features. It's 34 inches in size with a 21:9 aspect ratio and an ultra-wide format. It's got a subtle 1800R curvature, which is nice on a screen this size and not too steep. It's actually based on the same Gen 1 Samsung QD-OLED panel as the existing 175Hz 34-inch OLED monitors that you will find available on the market. So this is actually one of the earlier panels underneath, the same in fact that MSI used on their previous and first OLED monitor, the MEG 342C, that was released a while back. However, MSI have updated all of the monitor features and extras, and it's now very similar in feature set to their other 2024 OLED monitors like the 27-inch, 32-inch and 49-inch models that we've reviewed recently. Links to all of those reviews are in the description below as well. There's now a fanless design with a custom heatsink and graphene panel used for cooling, and the screen is also backed by the same 3-year warranty including burn-in cover that the other screens have. There's also all the new panel protection features under their OLED Care 2.0 suite as on their other models, including the new taskbar detection, multi-logo detection and border protection features that we found quite useful on the other models. There's a USB-C connection with DisplayPort Alt mode and 15 watts power delivery. That's a bit lower than their MPG series models though. There's also a KVM switch function, picture-in-picture and picture-by-picture support, proper HDMI 2.1 ports for consoles, and an updated design as well. Unlike some of their other new MAG series OLED monitors, this 34-inch screen does also include support for firmware updates, so that isn't something you need to be worried about on this model. And it also supports their gaming intelligence software for controlling your settings via an app if you want to. We'll discuss some of the other specs and features in the relevant sections of this review later as well. MSI have been releasing a lot of new OLED monitors this year in both their premium MPG series and their more mainstream MAG series. We're planning to provide a summary of all of their OLED monitors and explain all of the differences in features and what they mean soon. So we'll link to that in the description below when it's available on our main site. For now, in this 34-inch screen size, only this new MAG model has been launched so far, which is the model that we're reviewing here today, although an MPG model with a slightly different spec and a newer 240Hz Gen 2.5 QD-OLED panel is also planned for later in Q2. More info on that model linked below as well, and we should be reviewing and comparing that to this screen next month, so make sure you hit subscribe to stay up to date. Let's look at gaming first of all, as that's the primary market for this monitor. Being an OLED panel, it's well equipped of course to handle gaming and HDR with near instant response times, per pixel level dimming and amazing contrast. The ultra-wide format provides a wider field of view, giving you more space for games where this is supported, which looks really great and makes a real difference. This is especially fun for racing games and it's a very popular format for these genres. We don't need to say too much about the response times, which are excellent as always from this panel technology. We measured a 0.51 milliseconds grey to grey, which remains consistent at all refresh rates and across the variable refresh rate range. There's a small amount of overshoot along the top row of the table here with changes from black to grey, but in practice this wasn't visible and so wouldn't be considered a problem. When it comes to gaming experience, we've captured some pursuit camera photos here as well, which demonstrate real-world perceived motion clarity of the panel. This screen is a little clearer and sharper during gaming than the 144Hz OLED monitors that you can find on the market, including for instance the recently reviewed MSI MPG 491 CQP, their 49-inch super ultra-wide display. It can also support slightly higher frame rates for games, which in turn reduces your end-to-end latency a little bit too. You can get further improvements in motion clarity and frame rate support if you move up to higher refresh rates like 240Hz and even 360Hz now in the OLED market. But the 175Hz available here offers decent mid-tier performance. The screen can support variable refresh rates from compatible systems, although in certain situations and games you might see some flicker, which is an inherent problem with OLED panels and something we hope to investigate further in the future. It has been certified under the AMD FreeSync Premium Pro scheme, and it also supports VRR for consoles via the HDMI 2.1 ports. We also confirmed that the screen does support NVIDIA DSR and DLDSR technologies, even at the full resolution and refresh rate, meaning you can upscale the image resolution if your system can handle it, to increase the detail in gaming. This is actually achieved here because oddly the screen doesn't use display stream compression or DSC at all. This actually leads to a little bit of a gap at the top end in the refresh rate range where at 175Hz you're restricted to 8-bit colour depth only over the DisplayPort connection, and there's not enough bandwidth without DSC to accommodate this fully at 10-bit. Over DisplayPort you can only get 10-bit colour depth if you drop to refresh rates of 144Hz or lower, which then fits within the available data rate bandwidth of DisplayPort 1.4. But in practice this is unlikely to cause any problems using it at 8-bit, as you're very unlikely to spot any visual difference between 8-bit and 10-bit colour for the intended use cases of this screen. Or the other option here is to connect over HDMI 2.1 if your graphics card has that as an output, as that can support 10-bit at 175Hz fine, as it has more bandwidth available. Input lag is super low at the native refresh rate, as with all of their other new OLED monitors, and so should be perfectly fine for competitive gaming. It's higher for devices with a fixed 60Hz input, although keep in mind that it's the 175Hz figure that applies for VRR PC gaming, so the vast majority of situations you'll be getting that nice low lag. Console support was very good here as well, thanks to the proper full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports. You can input a virtual 4K resolution, which importantly allows then for HDR support from an Xbox Series X, and you can run the console up to 4K 120Hz fine. Despite being an ultra-wide screen, there are ample aspect ratio controls in the menu to handle the non-native 16:9 input ratio, and there's support here for features like VRR and HDMI CAC, which are handy. This screen only supports HDR10 content, not Dolby Vision HDR, so there's a small gap there for some supported games. The only other gap seemed to be the lack of support for 24Hz content at 4K, at least as reported by the Xbox Series X. Because this screen is using one of the original Gen 1 Samsung QD-OLED panels, the text clarity isn't as clear as on newer QD-OLED monitors in its second and third generation. It's the older pixel shape, so you get a bit more fringing on text as a result. It's not terrible or anything, but it can be a bit distracting for office and text work, and we spotted the step backwards compared with the Gen 2 and 3 panels we've been reviewing in recent months. We'd advise some caution if you're looking to use the screen for lots of desktop applications, although having said that, OLED is probably not an ideal panel technology for these uses anyway. You can see various measurements here for spectral distribution and brightness control, and the large screen, ultra-wide resolution and comfortable text size make it well suited to occasional multitasking and productivity applications when you need to. You need to be mindful of using any OLED screen for lots of static content due to image retention risks, although the wide range of panel protection features and the 3-year panel burn-in warranty cover should give you some added peace of mind. The standard semi-glossy QD-OLED panel coating provides the usual clean and clear image, which we prefer generally over the quite grainy AG coating of competing WOLED monitors. Although it does lead to more glare and reflections, so you do need to be mindful of your ambient lighting levels and position. You'll get more noticeable reflections in well-lit rooms or if you've got windows or lamps that are near the screen. One other area of particular note is the excellent luminance uniformity across the screen, which was impressive here. There's a very good range of extra features that enhance the user experience, including USB Type-C with DisplayPort Alt mode and 15 watts power delivery for single cable connectivity from laptops and other devices. That power delivery is limited here on the MAG series screen, so keep that in mind and take note of how much power delivery your device needs to draw. There's some USB data ports as normal and a KVM switch function, so you can use 2 connected systems from a single keyboard and mouse if you want. Picture-in-picture and picture-by-picture modes are available if you want to handle multiple inputs on the screen at once. There's a very good range of features on this model, like on their other new OLED screens, and it's a step up from many of the competing 34-inch ultra-wide OLED monitors previously released to the market. The screen comes out of the box in the Eco preset mode, which we tested first of all. This mode was generally pretty well set up, with a gamma curve close to 2.2 but showing a bit of deviation in darker grey tones, a decent grayscale colour temperature and white point very close to our target of 6500 Kelvin. In this mode the screen operates with its full native colour space, which we measured at reaching 140% relative to the sRGB gamut. This means that when you display sRGB content, including SDR, which is masked in that smaller colour space, the colours are oversaturated and more vivid than they should be, which results in poor colour accuracy and a delta E average of 5.4 in our measurements. This is common for wide colour gamut screens though, and we'll look in a moment at approaches to improve SDR colour accuracy. Relative to several wide gamut colour spaces, there is very good absolute coverage of DCI-P3 and Adobe RGB, making it a viable screen to use for this kind of work and this kind of content in both of those gamuts in theory. You can see that the native gamut of the panel extends a reasonable way beyond those two reference colour spaces though, although it's reasonably close to DCI-P3 overall. As a result, in the native mode, viewing DCI-P3 colours is better than viewing sRGB colours and results in a moderate colour accuracy with a delta E of 3.2 measured. As with other recent MSI OLED monitors, there are 3 provided emulation modes in the menu which will clamp the native colour space back to the target gamut. As you can see here, these all worked very nicely, cutting back the overcoverage of the native mode well and being only a few percentage points over in overall relative coverage. The DCI-P3 mode could have perhaps been a little tighter as it still had a 5.1% overcoverage in red shades. We tested the accuracy of each of these modes with particular interest in the sRGB mode, which might be commonly used to handle SDR content. The gamma in this mode dropped low in the very dark grey shades, indicating that contrary to the provided calibration report, this mode has probably been configured to the slightly different sRGB gamma curve instead of 2.2. It was generally good overall though. Colour temp and white point was slightly too warm in this mode by around 2 to 3%, because the red channel balance was a little off. You don't have access to the colour temp or RGB controls in the OSD in these emulation modes though, but it was still close to the target. You do however still have access to the brightness control, meaning you can customise the brightness to suit your preferences and ambient lighting conditions. With the colour space now nicely clamped back to sRGB, the accuracy of sRGB colours was good, with an average delta E of 1.9 measured. This should be a nice, usable mode if you want to work with sRGB and SDR content more accurately. The other DCI-P3 and Adobe RGB emulation modes were a similar story, offering good overall gamma, a very slightly too warm colour temp and white point, and good colour accuracy thanks to the decent clamping of the colour spaces back to their intended gamuts. The Adobe RGB mode can be useful here if you are doing any professional or photography work, which is often based on that colour space, and it's good that the panel can cover that gamut properly and that MSI provide an emulation mode for it as well at the hardware level. That's not often featured on competing monitors. After calibration, you get excellent results from the monitor. Here we've profiled the screen in the full native wide gamut mode, but mapped the colour space back to sRGB for colour aware applications. You can check out our best settings video guide linked in the description below, and also you might want to try out our calibrated ICC profile, which is available in our database, also linked below. Thankfully, despite there being no specific setting for this in the on-screen menu or it being referenced on the product page at all, the display operates with a uniform brightness behaviour in SDR mode. That means there's no automatic brightness limiter operation, and you get nice consistent brightness from the screen regardless of your window size and content. There's no annoying dimming as you resize and move Office documents around that happens on some OLED monitors. The luminance can reach up to 236 nits maximum in the Eco mode and user modes, which is a little lower than some other modern OLED screens which can reach up to around 260 to 270 nits commonly. This is also lower than can be reached in the HDR mode for full screen white, where it reaches around 270 nits as well. So it's a shame that it's capped a little lower in SDR mode really. This should still be adequate for most users unless you want to use the display in brighter room conditions. It doesn't reach quite as bright in the emulation modes as shown here as well, so that's something else to keep in mind. For instance, reaching 215 nits in the sRGB mode maximum. This performance was consistent in the Windows desktop, by the way, outside of test pattern measurements. We provided some recommended settings here to achieve common 200, 150 and 120 nits luminance levels. The screen can also reach down to a low luminance of 31 nits if you need to use the screen in darker environments. SDR shadow detail was reasonable, with the first RGB box that was visible being number 4. Note that the box that you can see on the screen that you're viewing this video from is of the test pattern, not a photo, and that will mean that, of course, the pattern varies depending on your screen. OLED panels often struggle natively with this shadow detail, but it was reasonable here. Being a QD-OLED panel, you do need to be mindful of your lighting position, as any bright light sources located in front of the screen can impact the perceived black depth because of the lack of a polarizer on the panel and the inadvertent activation of the quantum dot layer. That causes blacks to be raised and sometimes start to look more grey in appearance. That's an inherent challenge on QD-OLED panels, as we've explored in detail in our recent study, and so the ambient light handling here is rated poor relative to competing WOLED panels. When it comes to HDR, this monitor is really well equipped to handle HDR from a hardware point of view thanks to its OLED panel, which offers per pixel level dimming, true blacks and basically an infinite contrast ratio in the right ambient lighting situations. HDR content should ideally be viewed in a dark and dimly lit room, so the potential raised blacks on the QD-OLED panel is less likely to be a problem in those situations. Viewing in those conditions will also help reduce the glare and reflections that you might experience otherwise on the screen's semi-glossy coating. Anyway, the OLED panel's per pixel level dimming means that you don't get any halos or blooming in HDR content like you do on many LCD monitors, even those with high-end mini LED backlights. The panel also offers the wide colour gamut necessary to support HDR content mastered commonly in the DCI P3 colour space, giving you that colourfulness boost for that kind of content too. The screen has the familiar 2 HDR modes available in the on-screen menu for True Black 400 and Peak 1000. We'll talk about the brightness in a moment, but we measured both modes first of all using our standard testing approach. The True Black 400 mode has a generally accurate setup, although there's a couple of areas to note. Firstly, if you refer to the EOTF graph on the right hand side here, which tracks the PQ curve for HDR content, you can see that in the near black dark grey shades, the grey line for the monitor is slightly higher than the yellow target line. This means that the luminance of those darkest grey shades is a little higher than intended, which in practice results actually in clearer and more easy to distinguish shadow detail. This doesn't impact actual black depth, and so blacks are not being raised here, but the very darkest grey shades look a little brighter and are easier to make out. This is less accurate and further away from the artistic intent of the content, which is often very dark as it's mastered in a light controlled environment, with the intention of it being viewed in a dark room as well. But on the other hand, this does actually make it a little bit easier to use in environments that are brighter, making it a bit easier to see the shadow detail in the daytime or in more typical ambient lighting conditions. Because blacks remain black, we don't actually mind this slight raising of the luminance for the darkest grey shades, to be honest, to make HDR viewing easier in more moderately lit environments. It would be better if there were options to do this deliberately and specifically to your liking, but on the whole it's not a major problem in practice. Colour temp and white point were very good overall as well, which was pleasing, and with the wide colour gamut of the QD-OLED panel, there was decent coverage of the DCI P3 and Rec 2020 colour spaces, and very good colour accuracy as well. It's a similar story in the Peak 1000 mode, and in fact the RGB balanced colour temp and white point were even more accurate in this mode, being basically spot on and resulting in an excellent grayscale accuracy. You can see the same deviance for very dark grey shades where the luminance is a bit higher than intended, but again this doesn't raise blacks at all and serves to make shadow detail a little bit clearer in rooms that aren't fully dark. Let's talk about brightness then, as this is a more complex area and our recent studies and investigations have uncovered some complexities which seem to be common across many modern OLED screens. We've been working hard to bring you even more complete and easy to understand data to create a far more in-depth analysis of real-world HDR performance. It's still a bit of a work in progress, and you will start to see more testing and more information in our forthcoming reviews. For the purposes of this review, let's start by comparing the typical white luminance measurements of both available HDR modes, where we get the following results which are fairly typical and probably as expected really if you've seen any other OLED monitor reviews in the last few years. The True Black mode caps out at around 477 nits maximum, even for the smallest APL sample sizes, whereas the Peak 1000 mode can reach the full potential of the panel at 1046 nits. For a simpler view, we can compare the two modes directly on this graph, and based on these initial measurements, you might conclude that both modes reach the same brightness for all APL levels until you get to the smaller highlights below 10%, at which the Peak 1000 mode can then reach a lot higher. The Peak 1000 mode would therefore seem optimal and brighter, right? Unfortunately, it's a lot more complex than this, and rather than turn this video into an hour-long discussion about the intricacies of HDR performance and measurement, we'd encourage you to read our detailed study on this topic linked below. We will be updating that again soon with new information about how we're going to improve our testing methodology further, and that will likely be based on data obtained from this very screen. So that will give you more information about the performance when that's published soon. For now, like on other modern OLED screens we've tested, the True Black 400 mode can appear brighter in certain situations than the Peak 1000 mode, so we would encourage and recommend experimentation with both. The Peak 1000 mode will reach brighter highlights, but scenes that are overall quite bright with a higher average picture level, or APL, will often look brighter in the True Black mode. We also investigated recently how colour brightness is impacted by different OLED panel technologies and colour spaces, and that's one aspect of HDR performance that cannot be accounted for in simple white luminance measurements either. We already have a method in place to measure colours and convert them to an XCR score that represents perceived brightness in real use by the viewer. You can see on this graph that the brightness of colours can still be high even for the smallest APL measurements and the smallest HDR highlights in content, which is the strength of QD-OLED technology. To put it into perspective more, here's a graph showing the same results but from a modern WOLED panel that has a higher 1300 nits peak brightness spec. You can see that while the brightness of white can reach higher on this panel, the brightness of colours reaches a peak at around 25% APL and cannot get any brighter beyond that. This can lead to some washout of the image and colours for smaller APL scenes where white is boosted but colours cannot keep up. In practice, along with the smaller colour gamut of those WOLED panels compared with QD-OLED, this can lead to a less colourful looking image. This will of course vary depending on the WOLED panel you're comparing it to, and keep in mind here that this example is one of only a couple of modern WOLED screens with the increased 1300 nits peak brightness spec as well. The take-home point here really is that colour brightness remains very strong on the screen even for the smallest APL thanks to its QD-OLED panel. It's very similar to the 27, 32 and 49-inch models, for instance basically being identical to the 32-inch model compared here. In conclusion then, the MAG 341 CQP offered some very good performance that was in line with our expectations having tested several other 2024 OLED monitors from MSI. You've of course got the usual super fast response times and strong motion clarity that this technology can offer, although it is a bit slower at 175Hz compared with the wide range of 240Hz or above OLED monitors that you can buy now. It's still very good for gaming though, and this includes very low input lag and great support for consoles thanks to the proper HDMI 2.1 connections. We like the ultrawide format for games where it's supported as well, and outside of that for multitasking and productivity applications. HDR setup was nice and accurate in terms of colours, although there continues to be some issues with the brightness accuracy across all of these modern OLED screens that needs further investigation from manufacturers. Hopefully all of our additional testing and feedback that we're providing will help them and others provide a fix for these issues and improve the accuracy overall. With two HDR modes available to choose between, we expect most users will be able to find a comfortable performance though, but some improvements to the EOTF tracking from MSI and from other manufacturers will hopefully improve the performance in the brighter mode in real use. Default setup was good. There's a decent range of emulation modes to choose from if you want to work with specific colour spaces and a uniform brightness operation in SDR. The screen can't get quite as bright as more recent panels for SDR, which may be a little bit more limiting to some people. And the panel still uses the older pixel structure from Gen 1 QD-OLED, which means that text clarity is not as good and you get a bit more fringing. It's not as well suited to office applications as more recent QD-OLED monitors. At the moment, there's only two choices for the actual underlying OLED panels in this 34-inch segment. There's the 175Hz QD-OLED panel, with a subtle 1800R curvature from Samsung Display that's used here, and a WOLED panel from LG Display, which has a higher 240Hz refresh rate, but a much steeper 800R curvature, which personally we find too extreme for most users. There's only a couple of monitors released using that WOLED panel, and we've reviewed the Asus ROG Swift PG34WCDM, which is one of them, and that's linked below in the description. Overall, we prefer this QD-OLED panel though, and it's good to see MSI incorporate it into their modern monitor lineup, offering a new model in this size and adding quite a few new features and extras from their 2024 range that many of the competing models from other manufacturers lack. Our long-standing recommendation in this 34-inch segment has been the popular Dell Alienware AW3423DWF, but the MSI MAG 341 CQP now replaces that as our current favourite. It's got a slightly higher refresh rate, 175Hz compared with the 165Hz of the Dell, better connectivity including USB-C and proper HDMI 2.1 ports, and added features like KVM switch and a fanless design. The Dell model retails for $900 at the time of this video. An MSI screen has the same recommended retail price, but is sometimes available at $800. Whether it's the same price or a bit cheaper than the Dell offering, we think that makes it a very attractive option in this 34-inch OLED monitor space. We'll leave links to where you can check pricing and buy the screens in your region in the description below as well. We do look forward to seeing and testing the upcoming MSI MPG model, the 341 CQP-X, which will use the newest Gen 2.5 Samsung QD-OLED panel with an increased refresh rate of 240Hz, and also the move to the improved pixel structure. That should improve text clarity like it has on their other size panels. And we should be featuring a review of that model in the near future, so do hit subscribe to make sure you stay up to date. For now, we think the MAG 341 CQP is the pick of the 34-inch OLED monitors available, and definitely worth checking out. We'd love to hear in the comments section below which OLED monitors you're looking to buy and answer any questions that you might have. Thank you for watching. We'll catch you next time.